impactful, I can do this right now things in 60 minutes. And so I'm not going to try to do that necessarily, but hopefully we can leave you with some things that you can take back to wherever you work with your team and apply them directly. So I tend to wander a little bit, so hopefully you don't get dizzy by that. Let's kind of start with a quick bio, kind of who I am, where I came from, what I do. As the intro mentioned, I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. So those of you who are familiar with your geography, is that little peninsula hanging off the east coast of Canada, kind of east of Maine. I grew up there like any good Canadian kid. I played hockey, I ran track, I did all sorts of things. One of the reasons that I was interested and became interested in sports psychology is because of my strong athletic background. And ironically, I was a better runner than I was a hockey player. And what was interesting is that when I ran track. I was sort of a mid-distance runner. And when you mentioned triathlons, I should emphasize that like it's really triathlon. I did triathlons before we started having kids, and I took a 10-year hiatus, and I just completed my first triathlon in a decade last month. So let's go singular for now and see how it goes. But loved running, loved sort of that distance type of environment. However, whenever the track meet was happening, my routine, my pre-race ritual was quite literally to throw up. That was, and it's not like I didn't want to, but that's kind of how it happened. And through some sort of self-exploration and 10 years of education in sports psychology, I realized, oh, that was anxiety. Oh, I get it now. When it came to hockey, I was fine. Any game, any tournament, championship game, didn't really matter. I was able to get out on the ice, do my thing, and not really worry about it. I was excited. I had that sort of like nervousness, but also that kind of desire, that adrenaline pumping. Running was the opposite. I spent so much energy worrying about losing, worrying about not performing well, worrying about kind of tripping over, getting lost in the pack, all of these different things. And it was later on that I figured out that, well, in hockey, if I make a mistake, I've got 4 guys and a goalie to back me up. In track and field, I'm on my own. If I get a bad start, if I get stuck behind somebody, if I get boxed in, that's on me. And so if I don't have the desired result, if I don't finish in the way that I thought that I could, that all arrows point to me, as opposed to hockey, where it's really more of a win as a team, lose as a team type of mentality. And so I was kind of okay with that. And so it took some time for me to figure that out. But one of the key things that I discovered through that experience was that the enjoyment piece was central to my performance and to my experience. I loved hockey because I didn't have that anxiety to perform, whereas in track and field, I felt so nervous that I dreaded those meets. I loved training, I loved being with my team, but the competition piece was sort of missing. So, as we all sort of do, we have this desire to understand our experiences. And a mentor once told me in graduate school, research is me-search. And so you kind of figure out what's wrong with you, and that sort of becomes your area of research. And so I was really interested in sort of figuring that out, but also it kind of motivated me to pursue psychology, to sort of try to understand, predict, in some cases, control behavior. So undergraduate in psychology, and then I figured out that sports psychology was a thing. And I was never good enough to play pro, so let's just get that out in the open. But I also didn't want to be a coach, and so I knew what the demands of that position involved. And so I was kind of battling with, like, do I go into sport communication? Do I want to be a broadcaster? Like, what is it? And so I found this opportunity to really blend 2 things that I really love: the environment that I love being a part of, and a field that I really love to study and practice in. So sports psychology is not just psychologists that work with athletes. It is its own thing that you can pursue. And as of 2017, University of Kentucky is the only program in the state that has formal training in sport and exercise psychology from a performance standpoint. So undergraduate degree, graduate degree at McGill University in Montreal. I then came south of the border, south of the 49th, because a lot of the programs in Canada are really more focused on research. They're very research heavy, and that's great for some folks, not this guy. And so I had this desire to work with people. My drive was to be an applied practitioner. And so I did some digging, a lot of research, and found that West Virginia University, so not too far away from Lexington, probably not too far away from where many of you work, was the ideal setting for me. In fact, it was one of the better programs in North America. And part of the reason for that was because you complete a PhD in sport and exercise psychology, but you also do a master's in clinical mental health counseling. And so you're able to get credentialed in both areas. And I'll explain a little bit about where that divide is and how those things work harmoniously. But that was important to me. And because performance anxiety can be, you can do some deep breathing, you can employ some techniques to kind of help curve that a little bit, but you're not really solving the problem. And so for me, I had a desire to solve the problem, or at least understand it. Following graduation in 2014 from WVU, where I met my wife, she was also completing a PhD in a different field. We met in stats class, of all places, multivariate statistics. We sat next to each other on the first day, introduced ourselves, and 14 years later, we're still together. We have 2 wonderful children. So wonderful opportunity to also talk to people that were going through similar type of things in graduate school. But we both got jobs at UK. We both started off as lecturers. It was a 1-year contract. It was renewable at the end of the year. We figured, let's just move to Kentucky. Maybe it'll be a year, maybe 2. It'll be a stepping stone into something bigger and better. Probably, maybe, who knows. So we landed here, and as you can tell, we are still here. We ended up loving Kentucky, and never thought in a million years that a kid from Nova Scotia would end up in Lexington, but here we are. But I saw an opportunity to develop something at Kentucky. And at the time, if you can believe it, given the budget and the notoriety of UK athletics, nobody was doing anything with UK athletics from a mental health or performance standpoint. And that seemed odd to me. And so I literally looked on the UK page at the time. I closed my eyes. I pointed at 3 different coaches. And I decided, what the heck? I sent them an email and I said, here's who I am. Here's what I do. It's free. And all 3 of them said, absolutely, come on by. And pure coincidence, they ended up being in the same hallway over at the Joe Kraft Center. So that was easy for me as well. But the 3 sports were our volleyball team. So Craig Skinner, head coach of the volleyball team, Harry Mullins, the head coach of our rifle team, and Brian Craig, who's the head coach of our men's golf program at the time. So those were the 3 coaches that I literally just landed on. And I promise you, this has nothing to do with me, but that year, the volleyball team won their first SEC championship since 1988. The rifle team won a national championship, and then the golf team made it further into the playoffs that they've ever made it. And so every coach around the department was like, well, who the hell is this guy? And so I'm just kind of standing there twiddling my thumbs, and I was like, I just happened to slide in at the right time. So that sort of developed into a relationship where coaches became interested in this added resource that they could add to their arsenal, that they could offer their student athletes. So Mr. Barnhart offered to buy me out completely. I would go over to UK Athletics 100% of the time. I would oversee all 22 programs, and that seemed attractive. But on the academic side of things, I moved from a lecturer to assistant professor. And those of you in academia know that comes with a tenure clock. And so I was like, ooh, stability, that sounds great. And so I kind of gave a thanks but no thanks to Mr. Barnhart, and we landed on 50%. And so through some negotiating back and forth, half the time I live in academia, I mentor students, I do research, I teach courses. The other half of me oversees the counseling and performance psychology for all 22 of our athletics programs. So to me, that allows me to apply what I'm doing in the real world in the classroom, which I think my students appreciate. But also from a teaching standpoint, it forces me to stay relevant on the research so that I can apply that in my practice. And so that's a little bit of a snapshot on me. Nowadays, I do a lot of this kind of stuff, mostly because it really does, it forces me to kind of step out of my comfort zone a little bit. We are starting some programming with the UK School of Medicine, or College of Medicine, I should say, where we're piloting some mental performance programs with some of our surgery programs. We are working a lot with the UK School of Music. I do a lot of consulting with corporate leaders and those kinds of things. So that allows me to kind of get to a point where we are kind of crossing boundaries a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in some slides to come. So back when I was in grad school, I was flying somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but I was sitting on a plane. And as we do when we're sitting on a plane and we're traveling by ourselves, we tend to spark a conversation with the person next to us. And so it was about an hour and a half into the flight, and I don't know, my movie was over, or I was bored of my book or something. And so person next to me starts chatting, and inevitably the conversation comes around to like, oh, what do you do for a living? And so I was studying sports psychology at the time, and was chatting a little bit about what it was and what it involved, and opportunity to work with elite athletes and all that kind of stuff. And so she was interested, but and when it finally got around to asking what she did for a living, she was a nurse, and she was working in rural Michigan. And she talked a lot about her job and what it did. And I was familiar with nursing. My aunt was a nurse. My neighbor growing up was a nurse. So I heard a lot about what was going on. But through some conversation, we realized, there's a lot of, in her job, managing emergencies with oftentimes limited backup. We acknowledge some of the realities of long hours, fewer resources, high patient loads, some of that emotional toll that goes into the position. And I wasn't in any way trying to say like, oh, I know what that's like. I work with 18-year-old student athletes. But part of the conversation was, I'm familiar with this world. West Virginia at the time was part of the Big East, so it wasn't really considered a Power 5 conference school. We didn't have the seemingly limitless resources that some athletic departments had, as evidenced by the fact that graduate students were the ones doing the mental performance work, and they didn't have a fully embedded professional. And so we related a little bit in terms of like what we were both experiencing. And so it got around to asking the questions, which I'm going to kind of encourage you to reflect a little bit upon, is how do we perform, or how do we continue to perform at a high level when the system around us is stretched thin? And so, in other words, how do we continue to thrive, or how do we find an opportunity or an environment to be able to thrive when we don't have all of the things that we require in order to really take it at that next level? And I would argue that in some small part, this is where the science of performance psychology can offer some answers. And as I mentioned in my title slide just a little bit, I work a lot with non-athlete populations. And so it was through this experience that I was really able to learn one of the more fundamental lessons that sort of changed the way that I looked at the field. And so that lesson is, if you're human, you're performing. Doesn't really matter what you're doing. You're going on a date, you're on a job interview, you're meeting your in-laws for the first time. In some cases, you're going to the gym doing a simple workout. You are performing. And so for years, I studied sport and exercise psychology, and it really shifted then that it shouldn't be called sport and exercise psychology. It should be called performance psychology. And so if we take that idea, that foundational idea that if you're human, you're performing, then performance psychology should be accessible to everyone. And so one of the key spaces that performance psychology is really thriving right now is actually the U.S. military. U.S. Army is the #1 employer of performance psychology trained people. And it makes sense, right? So when you think of our soldiers on deployment, they are using techniques that we teach our student athletes to use. Things like developing resilience, grit, cohesion, communication, leadership, all of these different concepts that we are applying to 18 to 22-year-old kids are being applied to environments like that. And so performance psychology, in a sense, is not just for athletes. It's about performing consistently under stress. And so if we define what performance psychology is in plain language, right, we're trying to manage thoughts. We're trying to manage emotions and focus to deliver the best in all conditions, often including challenging conditions. So not always is it's not always a perfectly ideal situation for us to perform. Sometimes we have to overcome various barriers. And so we're drawing parallels between elite performers and surgeons, athletes, pilots, all that kind of stuff. So here we want to emphasize controllable factors. And one of the ways that I sort of explain performance psychology to people who've never really heard of it, I talk about capacity and ability. We all have a capacity. This is how well we can perform when the stars line up, when the environment is perfectly tailored for us to perform. And so, from an athlete's point of view, we're talking about performing at the right time of day, having the proper sleep and nutrition and training, and you were tapered properly, and all these different, got a good night's sleep the night before. And so capacity is the wind at your back, the sun's shining gently on your face, and all these different kinds of things you're performing at home. The reality is, if we're being honest, that capacity doesn't actually exist in the real world. The environment is never going to be tailored perfectly for any one individual. And so capacity, while it exists, it's largely hypothetical or theoretical. It's there, but it's not really there. And so when people have this perception of like, I had a little bit more to give, or I could have done better. And so our job is to sort of tease out some of those things and what was preventing you from getting to that level. And so what we deal with on a day-to-day basis is not our capacity. What we deal with is our ability. Our ability represents where we are right now, based on various factors: resources, teamwork, leadership, where you are in the world, even weather, right? And so while your capacity exists, and this is how good you can do, we are often operating kind of all over the place. Some days you have really good days and you're just crushing it. Some days you're kind of struggling a little bit. Most of the days you're kind of in this middle. And so this gap that exists, this spot, this is where people like me fit in, to try to understand as much as possible what is contributing to this space between our ability and our capacity. My job is not to help athletes perform higher than their capacity. They can't. This is their ceiling. But if I can help them understand what factors, what controllable factors contribute to being close to here as consistently as possible, then that's when we start to get the ball rolling a little bit. And we have this formula in performance psychology. It's performance equals potential minus disruption, right? So our potential to do whatever minus whatever disruption or factors that prohibit us is essentially where we end up. And so I'm curious, and let's try to make this a little bit interactive if we can. I know there's quite a few people in the room, but what possible disruptions could we be considering when we think about things that prevent us from performing at our potential? And this could be athletic or healthcare, it really doesn't matter. Technology failure, sure. An illness, absolutely. Injury. What else? Stress. What about from a sports standpoint? What are we talking about in terms of disruption? Pardon? Injury. Competitors, how good they are, absolutely. How well matched are we? All types of things. So we could literally go all day and talk about the various distractions and the various disruptions. One of the more common ones that we talk about, actually, and we are fortunate that if you are a UK fan, then I'm including you in this fortunate group, that a lot of our teams actually perform really well on the national stage. We have a lot of ranked teams. We have a lot of really high-performing individuals. Winning and success can actually be a disruption. Right? So when we do well, when we win championships, when we have a winning record and those kinds of things, that can often become a disruption to achieving our overall potential. Because when we win, when we get that reward, when we're reinforced for performing a certain way, we rarely look at how could we have done it better. We often seek feedback when things go wrong, when we're missing the boat a little bit. When we underperform or when we lose, we go back to the drawing board, we check our strategy, we try to figure out what went wrong. But when we win, and especially if we win in spectacular fashion, right? An overtime toss, all of a sudden everybody's going crazy, 65,000 people in the stadium are losing their minds, then you're so elated that you kind of forget like, oh, we played 2 really bad quarters in that game, but that sort of gets masked away. And so success can often be a disruption that we need to pay attention to. So I mentioned earlier my dual degree training, and it's important to kind of distinguish the two here. So I tend to think of sports psychology as an umbrella term, right? So within that umbrella, underneath that umbrella, we have 2 very important subfields. We have mental health, which is obvious, right? So if you're following the news, if you're following the sort of world stage of athletics at the Olympic level and things like that, you're probably familiar with names like Michael Phelps, with Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, all coming forward and talking about their various struggles with mental health and preventing them from performing at their highest level. So that's certainly part of it. The other side of the umbrella, sorry, this was my mental health slide. The other side of the umbrella, if we think about it as a sort of a dichotomous thing, is mental fitness. Mental fitness represents how can we help individuals foster and use techniques to perform better. Now, certainly these two things interact. And some folks in our field are holding the umbrella. They are the handle. They are bridging the gap between the two. Some focus mostly on this, whereas others decide to focus mostly on this. In healthcare, we have a ton of research on things like burnout, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, those types of things. And I'm not minimizing that in any way, shape, or form. Those things are important. I am a licensed mental health professional, and I obviously value the importance of this. But what is rarely talked about is how can we use the resources that we have, even limited resources, to enhance our performance. And so I have been on record saying that mental health is a necessity, mental fitness is a luxury. And now that I've been in the field for about 20 years, I'm going to amend that statement by saying both are necessities. I really, truly believe that, in that, like, to properly enhance everyone's performance, whether you work at a desk or whether you're working in the OR or the emergency room, you have the right to improve your performance using all of the resources that you have at your disposal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a model that we use in psychology, specifically in psychology of injury, which relates to stress. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a stress injury model. It was published in the late 90s by two researchers, Williams and Anderson. The part that I really want to focus on here is this middle portion. So this kind of central slice, not to say that the above and the below don't really matter, but because they do. But the thing that I want to emphasize is this relationship that we have between stress and response. And so every situation, whether you're an athlete or just walking around, is a potentially stressful situation, right? So anything could potentially cause a person stress. What matters is how we interpret the situation, based on our experiences, based on our skills, based on our personality differences, all of these different kind of things. So in other words, how we appraise a situation has more to do with the actual situation, or has more to do than the actual situation. And so here we're linking things like chronic stress, right, to risk of emotional or physical breakdown. And so we have an established relationship between things like chronic stress, the secretion of cortisol, immunosuppressive response, all of these different kinds of things that could cause things like vulnerability. And in the case of athletes, injury. Right? So if we're so stressed by the fact that we're playing in Rupp Arena with 24,000 screaming fans, and we know that we're on the SEC network and it's the Final Four and all these different kinds of things, we may get distracted, right? We may not be paying attention to various things. And so we oftentimes have a physiological response to that stress that could lead to injury or any kind of illness. And so we know that there's a direct relationship here. And so the elements that are below and the elements that are above are kind of where people like myself come in, right? So yes, the potentially stressful situation. If we've got Tom Brady heading into the Super Bowl, well, he's been there 8 times before. So chances are he's pretty used to the pressures and kind of what it's going to feel and look like and sound like and all that kind of stuff. Versus if we've got a first-time quarterback going into a Super Bowl situation, it may cause that person to experience a little bit of a heightened response, okay? Their heart rate's going up, their muscles tense up, their kind of mind is going all over the place, and so they're not really able to execute as well. And so if we're using this example and kind of translating it to what you all experience on a day-to-day basis, considering how you're responding to certain things may impact your overall vulnerability at the end of the day. And so this is kind of how we assume things exist. Whenever we talk about behaviors as a result of various situations, this is kind of how this is what people think happens, right? So something occurs, a situation, a stimulus, right? You get called into your boss's office and all of a sudden you start to freak out, right? So your body responds in a certain way. Or the ref makes a bad call, the other team scores a touchdown, and you throw your helmet down in frustration, you go back to the bench, you put your head between your legs, and you start to brood, or you start to kind of steam up and you start lashing out at people, all these different kinds of things. This is what we assume happens. So when coaches say like control, like respond in a way that's, conducive to your future performance, sure. But if you assume that nothing happens in between these two things, there's not much you can do, right? You are just a victim of the situation. So if we kind of rethink this in a way, we start to recognize that, yeah, something does happen, right? And this happens instantaneously, by the way. This happens so quick that we assume that nothing else is existing in here. But a thought occurs, right? We interpret the situation, we appraise it, right? We think about, A, how does this impact me? And that's called primary appraisal, by the way. We always think how any situation, whatever happens, doesn't matter what it is, our first reaction is, how is this going to impact me? And that's not you being selfish, that's just how the brain works. The brain is there to protect the rest of your body. So it's going to assume, it's going to think about whatever situation, how is this impacting me? Primary appraisal. Secondary appraisal, what happens immediately after, is we start to think, do I have the resources to overcome whatever is being presented in front of me? And then we can start thinking about like kind of altruistic beliefs. How is this going to impact my community? How is this going to impact the people around me, the ones that I love, and all these different kinds of things. But the point is that we interpret the situation. We think. As a result of this thought pattern, as a result of this interpretation, right, we develop an emotional response. We're happy, we're sad, we're frustrated, we're angry, all of these different kinds of things. Then, and only then, do we then engage in some kind of behavioral response. Now, the important thing to note here is that within this model, right, we have things that are controllable versus uncontrollable. And that is, by the way, Sports Psych 101. The one thing that I want all my students to understand literally on day one, or any athlete or performer that comes into my office, is that there are things in your life and in your sport that you can control, and there are things that you cannot control. And there are things that you just need to accept, right? It gets a little bit more complex than that, but that's the crux of it. You cannot control the situation or the stimulus. It has happened. The bell has been rung. And then you are responsible for everything that happens as a result of that, right? You control those thoughts. You control your response. And this is why I emphasize we want to respond as opposed to react. So when you were a kid and your parents told you, just sleep on it, right? Or even as an adult, you know that you're going to make an emotional response to a situation, or it's going to be fueled by emotion. You got to take a step back, you think about it, you consider all of the alternatives, all of the options and things like that, and you respond. How is response different than reaction, by the way? Why is it that a response is more desirable, do we think? Operating in self-control, which leads to a more intentional type of behavior, right? You do it because you mean to do it, as opposed to being sort of a victim of just like that this quick process that occurs. So I wonder if you can all sort of engage in a little bit of self-reflection here and think about or recall a recent high-pressure moment and how your mindset either shaped the outcome. So this could be a positive outcome, this could be a negative outcome, but think about a situation, whether it was a confrontation at work, whether it was an emergency, it could even be parenting or a relationship, romantic relationship, or a conversation with your parents or friends, right? But think about a situation where your mindset was the reason that the outcome was the way that it was. And again, whether it was intentional or it was like oops, I could have handled that better, because I was so skewed based on how I felt about the incident that I reacted a certain way, right? And we all have those kind of hindsight is 20/20 type of situations where, you're in the car after a fight or an argument or something like that, and like, I should have said that, right? Or, I could have done this a little bit differently, and reflection does provide the benefit to all of that kind of stuff. So this brings us a little bit to rural medicine. And the core idea here is that excellence isn't about abundance. It's about focus. It's about control. And We obviously have mentioned control the controllables, and if we can imagine 3 concentric circles. And at the center of the, think of a Target logo, but with like a third one. Okay, so if we have at the center of the bullseye here, we have those elements that we have control over. Okay, these are our thoughts, our work ethic, our communication patterns, our everyday sort of actions. The middle circle I call the influence circle. So these are things that you don't necessarily have direct control over, but you can impact, right? How your teammates behave, right? Whether or not they show up on time, or they're giving their 100% effort, or they're engaged during meetings or workshops or those kinds of things. Ultimately, you're not going to go into their room and make their bed, but maybe by making your bed and keeping your area tidy, then they're going to be, oh, yeah, maybe that does sound nice, and maybe I'm going to do that. Maybe you can have a conversation with them. So you don't directly control what they do, but you do have an influence on them. And then this third outer circle is the one that we're talking about, the uncontrollable one. And I don't want to put a percentage on it because I don't actually know, and I don't know that the research can actually tell us this, but an increasing amount of our anxieties are focused on those uncontrollable things. I know that in sports, 90% of the time people come in and they're worried about the opposition. Oh, we're playing, basketball team is about to play Purdue, and people are like, oh man, the #1 team in the country, like, what are we going to do there? Like, why does that matter? Just go out and do your thing, right? You are a very skilled team. Go out and do that thing. Why are you putting so much energy, so much emotion into those uncontrollable things that you have absolutely no power in? And so we want to introduce this idea of psychological flexibility, right? The ability to adapt under changing demands. Things are always sort of changing. And I know that you've seen this before, right? So we have fixed mindset. And so this represents really kind of this, things are the way they are. There's not much I can do about them. Let's just sort of exist within the setting that we're in. I am who I am. My training is what it is. There's not much we can do here, right? On the flip side of it, we have what's called growth mindset. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this. But essentially this idea that I'm still learning, I can keep trying. These are things that we motivate our kids to think about, right? No, you don't know how to do it yet. Right? We want to emphasize those things. Somehow as adults, we've sort of forgotten this, right? We always kind of assume like, yeah, I'm in my 40s. I guess learning is done. I am where I am. But no, why do we need to be like that? This may take some time and effort. Mistakes help me learn. This is kind of a positive adaptive profile for folks to have, right? And so things that we can do on a day-to-day basis, and we're going to talk about some of those strategies in just a minute. But, quick mental reset techniques between patients. If you're going back-to-back meetings, and this is something that I commonly have, I'll have, an athlete come in between 8 and 9, and then 9 to 10, and then 10 and 11, and then I finally have like a 30-minute break. Like, what am I doing in between those sessions so that I'm totally present for them during that time? So those kind of things are important. Maybe doing micro huddles to manage some uncertainty, right? Managing and normalizing things like compassion fatigue, which is something that we all know is very true in rural healthcare. Emphasizing things like team cohesion, psychological safety, the importance of leadership. Resilience is social. It's not individual, right? So the key message here is that resource scarcity doesn't define quality, or at least it doesn't have to. And so mindset and teamwork do. So I'm not going to say that this is the key to all of it, obviously, but seeing a way forward is going to be a piece of that puzzle. Finding a balance between accepting your situation and thriving in it versus stimulating change. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do. And so some of you may have children. I do. My girls are 10 and 7, and they're at that age where routine is key, right? They need to know what they need to do in the morning to be able to be out of the door so they get to school on time. When it's, bedtime, they've got a specific routine, those kinds of things. And when my daughter was actually just sharing with me yesterday, she said that their day at school was a little interrupted. I think they had a fire drill. And so simple thing that happens all the time in school systems. And she was kind of she was really sort of like shook up by this. And I was like, well, what happened during this fire drill? And nothing happened. It was a typical fire drill, but it was just that it interrupted the flow of her day. But if we think about our routines and things that we do every single day, there are things that we can engage in daily practice that can actually make a difference. So you don't actually have to wait for somebody to get hired to work in your center to look like someone like me and say, okay, this is good. This is something that we're going to embed within our culture. This is something that we're going to do every single week so that you develop those skills. It doesn't have to be officially like that. We can do things on a daily basis. And sometimes it takes a little bit of training. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a deeper understanding. How many people here have been told at some point in their lives when they were a little bit agitated and a little bit kind of overwhelmed, like, hey, take a deep breath, right? Or, hey, relax, relax. No one in the history of the universe has ever relaxed because somebody told them to relax, by the way. But like this idea of like, take a deep breath, that is actually, if you look at the science of it, counterproductive to actually relaxing. Because it's not the deep breath that helps you calm your nervous system. It's actually the long exhale. And so what people should be saying is like, hey, take a deep exhale. If you find yourself that you're nervous, your heart rate's going up and you feel yourself kind of feeling overwhelmed, inhaling, like taking an 8-second breath, actually makes your heart rate go higher. But if you're taking a 2-second breath and you're exhaling for 6 seconds, you're stimulating change in your nervous system that actually calms it down. So even in everyday conversations, we're throwing things around, hoping to be able to help people, but we're not actually doing it well. And so everybody knows how to breathe. Not everybody knows how to breathe properly. And so as a simple technique, understanding that could be a game changer. You're finding yourself feeling overwhelmed. You're about to step on a stage and address 175 to 200 strangers. I felt a little anxious. And so while I'm sitting there and you were sharing, I wasn't listening to any of it, but I was just like, all right, 2 seconds in, 6 seconds out, because I can't go up there and start hyperventilating and, start to freak out. So there are ways that we can help each other. And the first one that I will share, and this is by no means a full workshop on this concept, but most of you have heard of the term mindfulness, right? Mindfulness, we hear that all the time. Some people equate it to sort of like a Buddhist monk on the side of a hill in Tibet, meditating and quiet, looking at No, it's not that. Okay? Mindfulness is paying attention on purpose. It's being aware. It's being in the present moment. And we are being fired in so many different directions constantly. I've got like 5 devices that have the ability to distract me at any moment of the day. Now, right now it's on Do Not Disturb because I knew that if my watch started pinging or my phone started ringing and I get notifications, I would glance down on it. So it hasn't done anything and I haven't looked at it once. But I've got my watch, I've got my phone, I've got my tablet, right? Some people are wearing heart rate monitors and all these different kind of things. We've got computers that are connected to our phones and all these. So we are constantly being pulled in so many different directions. Honestly, don't cheat. How many people pull out their phones at a red light? Yeah, because 30 seconds is excruciating, right? Just to wait there and wait for the light to turn green. So that in and of itself is not preventing you from being mindful, but it's a symptom of the bigger issue. And so what we're trying to do is to get people to understand the value of being here, of being present. And it's difficult to do because it's a muscle that we need to train. And so little things that we can do throughout the day, if you take a break at work, right? Most people will take their phone. They're going to mindlessly scroll through social media. They're going to comment on a couple things. They may do a little bit of online shopping, right? Fine, but that's not refilling that tank. That's not providing you with an actual mental rest. You're just switching gears. And so being mindful allows you to, when you have a patient or when you're in a meeting, to be totally connected to the person that you're engaging with. Not, oh, is this more important than any of you? Doing that. As soon as a person comes into my office, I take my watch off, I put it over there because I know that if it starts to vibrate, I am going to glance at it. It's just like a reaction for me. And so engaging in small acts of mindfulness, going for a walk and just sort of existing, sitting on a bench for 10 minutes. If you find that excruciating, it means that you need it. It really does. If you can't sit there for 5 minutes without a phone or without a podcast or a song or anything like that, you desperately need this exercise. And that is going to trickle into every part of your life, to a point where you're watching TV and it's boring because it's only one screen, so you got to be on your phone as well doing something else. And so this is a skill, again, that is that translates across barriers. The second one that I want to make sure that we mention is this concept of emotional recovery and regulation. And so we all know that emotional overload and compassion fatigue are major contributors to burnout. Learning to calm the nervous system allows for better empathy, for better problem solving, and recovery after difficult cases. And I remember a situation when I was in undergrad. I'm checking the time here, I didn't get buzzed. I remember a situation when I was in undergrad. I was a sophomore. And at the time, I wanted to be a developmental psychologist. This was like what I thought I really wanted to do. And so I had enrolled in developmental psychology. I was finally past the Psych 101 hurdle. And so I was able to kind of do the courses that I felt I really wanted to do. And I was the kind of student, I sat near the front. I did the readings ahead of time. I was engaged in discussion. I paid attention. I showed up every single day. So by all accounts, I was the perfect student in that class. And when the first exam came around, we had two midterm exams and a final. First midterm exam came up. I didn't do poorly, but I felt like I could have done better given the effort that I put in. And so I remember going to office hours, and it was Dr. Elizabeth Bowering, who was my instructor. And I'll never forget her because she taught me a lesson that still, 23 years later, I still remember. And so we talked about, she said, you seem to be doing everything well. You're there, you're engaged, you seem to understand the material. And so let's not talk about your study habits. Let's talk about what you do after class. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, after I say, that's it for today, folks, we'll see you next time, what do you do? I said, I don't know. I do what everybody else does, and I close my book and I put it in my backpack and I move on to whatever's next in my day. And she said, I wonder if you could provide me with an extra 3 minutes buffer here. And so she said, try this. After class, draw a line across your page when you're done taking your notes and summarize. What were the key takeaways? What did you learn today? What was the point of today? Did we talk about Erikson's theory of psychosocial development? Did we talk about, positive reinforcement? Why did we bother meeting? What were your big sticky points? And it could be bullets, it could be paragraph. It honestly doesn't matter. Just summarize. And so I started doing that. 3 minutes after class turned into 5 minutes because I really got into it. And so I started doing that. And lo and behold, the second midterm, I ended up doing a lot better. And so I mentioned I was a hockey player. I played in college. And so I started doing that in hockey. And I was not the best player on the team. I was sort of a mid-level guy, serviceable. I was a role player. I had fun. And I would start doing that after every practice. After every practice, I would go back in the locker room. Before I even took my gear off, I took down my notebook. I would write the date, and I would write down, how did I get better today? What was the point of today's practice? Where did I improve? And what were the sticky points? And I found that this ended up doing 3 things. So let's kind of go back to the class example. The first thing that it did is it provided me an opportunity to immediately summarize what I've learned. Rather than the next time that I would honestly look at those notes was when I was studying for the exam, which could be three weeks from now. And so I'm writing down notes, I understand it, and then I immediately forget it, and then I'll revisit it in 3 weeks because that's when I need to study it again, right? Because I'm told you're going to be evaluated on this, so study it again. So it forced me to reflect on the entire portion of it. The second thing that it did is similar to the first one, but we have something in psychology called the recency bias and the primacy effect. Right? So the primacy effect is the tendency for us to remember things that happen at the beginning. And the recency bias is the tendency to remember things that happened at the end. And so in a 60-minute talk with me, you're probably going to remember a lot of what I talked about at the beginning and a lot of what I talk about at the end. But there's this kind of mushy gray area where you probably checked out, you're scrolling your phone, you're doing all kinds of things. And that's okay, right? Because it's difficult to be engaged during the entire time. And so if we reflect back on experiences, oftentimes we think about those key moments at the beginning because we were really engaged, really energized. And at the end, we were really engaged, really energized because it's almost over. And so we're kind of perking up and paying attention. And so that's sometimes how we leave various meetings. And so that's the second thing that it did. It provided me the opportunity to think about it holistically, not just the beginning, not just the end, not snippets throughout, but the entire thing. And the third one, which is related to what we're talking about here, or more so than the first two, is that it provided me with a transition. It allowed me to turn the page and close the book on class and move on to whatever was next in my day. And so when I take notes after a client, I'll just jot down a couple things. That means that my brain is not actively being challenged in my next session, trying to make sure that I remember what happened in that previous hour. If I just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, they all sort of jumble together and I forget the meaningful moments that I had with these individuals. One of the things that we, one of the things that we do in our house with our kids at the end of the day, one of our bedtime routine type of things is that we ask them, I was like, what was the last thing today that made you smile? And so it's just a simple question, something very, very simple. Actually, it was a lesson learned from somebody I know from Finland who I met in hockey, and that's something that they do a lot in Finnish culture. So I sit down with them in their bed. They're all showered. They're ready to go. They got their books and everything like that. What was the last thing today that made you smile or that made you happy? So it sort of primes them for the end of the day. And there's that, like, you know, it allowed me to reflect back on something happy before I shut my eyes and turn the page on the day. And so something that might be meaningful for some of you is every time you leave an engagement, whether it's a patient or whether it's a meeting or whatever it might be, could be, what was the last thing as part of that engagement that made me feel fulfilled? Or at the end of the day, at the end of the week, when was the last time that I felt like fulfilled in my position? Fulfillment is the kind of key that I'm trying to get here. The final thing that I hope you take away from this, and this is something that I've talked about in a lot of kind of recorded lectures, so I didn't want to make it the central part of my talk today, is how we define success. Oftentimes in sport, we define success as winning, right? Beating the opponent, outscoring the opponent, being an All-American, MVP, those types of things. And that's fair because we talk a lot about those things in the media and it's sort of kind of shoved down our throats. But there are different degrees of success. And I think it's valuable to think about them in your context as well. We have outcome success, the things that we know, the things that are talked about a lot that I mentioned earlier. And so this is, you know, getting to the finish line first. This is getting good numbers, beating last year's numbers, or whatever it is that defines success in your various positions. This oftentimes, if we think back to our 3 concentric circles, is an uncontrollable thing. We can't always control how the opponent is or who we're up against. There's a lot of factors in the outcome that we have no power over. Being an All-American athlete is not really an evaluation of how good the person is. It's how good they were compared to the rest. So if you're competing against really, really talented people, you don't always get that outcome. I could win every race I run if I ran against 5-year-olds. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't mean I'm successful. It just means that I ran faster than them. So good for me. But I could run like absolute garbage and still win the race. So I'm feeling good about that. But did I actually learn? Did I get better? And so we have to look at different layers here. We have to challenge that traditional view, that traditional definition of what it means to be successful. And this could involve looking at it from your own point of view. Did I get better? You know, the way that we rank people in some medical schools, like, oh, you're at the top of your class, doesn't necessarily mean that you were good. It just means that you did better than everybody else. But a lot of people, if we think back to that definition of performance, you know, being a product of potential minus disruption, success in the traditional sense could be a disruption to you actually moving forward. So when you're working with teams, when you're working with individuals, thinking about how, before you even start a project, how are we going to know if we were successful at this? Is it the amount of people that showed up to the conference? Or is it what they took away from the conference? And so looking at it from a performance standpoint, this is self-evaluative. This is often independent. Usually it should be independent. But this is how you did. How fast can you run from here to there? Not compared to other people, but just how quickly can you do it? And related to this, like I've had students I've given this example. Like, let's just say we're taking the organic chemistry, because that's just a class that everybody hates. So we're taking organic chemistry. I'm assuming. We're taking organic chemistry. We're taking the exam, and we come out of the exam. We get our grade, and you got a 91%. So you're feeling pretty good about that. It's organic chemistry. You're proud of that. You worked for it. You studied. You prepared. All that kind of stuff. Next class you go in, the professor stands up and says, "Whew, guys, the average was 95. The lowest grade was 91. Good on you." And you're sitting there like, "Oh, crap. Like, I thought I did really well, but all of a sudden, my elation of my performance just took a nosedive. All because I compared myself to someone else." So I understand. I will never stand on my soapbox and convince athletes and people not to want to win. I will never tell them winning doesn't matter. I will tell them it matters by doing the right things. And so your performance, your individual assessment of your performance matters. And finally, we have this kind of process-oriented mindset, which represents all of the little boxes that we check along the way, all of the fundamentals that we need to do in order to reach that performance. This is showing up to class, doing the readings, paying attention, engaging with peers, doing all the stuff, taking all the steps so that the performance is more likely to happen. That 91% is more likely to happen. And then the likelihood that you're going to be at the top of the class is going to be higher if you check these boxes along the way. So again, not saying winning doesn't matter. I like to win. I love to win, right? But I also appreciate the value of getting there the right way. So we're going to close with a couple reflections here. So mindset is a key piece to the puzzle. Time and time again, we see teams with tremendous potential fail to reach their goals due to lack of regulation. When we think again about the difference between capacity and ability, we start to wonder what exists in that gap. What is it that's preventing this team from reaching their potential? And so as you go back to your lives and in whatever environment that you're in, you're reflecting on, like, how do we help this team, this small group of people that we're working with, or large group of people that we're working with on a regular basis, reach their potential? A, what is our potential? What are our possible disruptions? How many of those are controllable? And how many of those can we train ourselves to overcome? You know, there's a couple things that we want to think about in terms of how to get the most out of the people that we're working with. So how many people here are considered leaders, whether it's like you're a team lead or you've got people under you working and things like that? So a fair bit. One of the things I encourage a lot of our coaches to do is to think about what potential blind spots do you have. It's really difficult to look internally and find faults. I'm not saying look for a fault, but look for something that you may overlook. And so when we think about blind spots, we think about hidden factors. In other words, what hidden factors within you, within me, might undermine the positive impact I'm aiming to make. And so if we remember back to elementary school, right? At some point we learned that anything multiplied by 0 is still 0. And so we could have all of the tactical knowledge, all of the technical knowledge. We could be an absolute juggernaut in what we're doing. But if we're lacking compassion or effective communication skills, then we are not really taking advantage of those skills that we have. And so those things start with an honest self-reflection, right? What are the possible things that I, as a leader or as a key stakeholder, am doing that could potentially be preventing my team from succeeding at the highest level that's possible for them to succeed? And so I'll leave you with these key takeaways. The first one, manage what you can control. That's not to say throw your hands up and say, well, it's out of our control, so let's just kind of do what we can. But your mindset, your focus, your energy, all of those self-sustaining things are up to you, right? That space between stimulus and response, that's within your control. Those parentheses represent things that you have power and agency over. You want to build teams through resilience, or you want to build team resilience through things like psychological safety. You want to create an environment where it's okay for people to try and potentially fail. Or rather than fail, not succeed, right? Because those are different concepts. But through things like psychological safety, communication, and shared coping. You've all been through experiences, sharing those experiences, being empathetic and understanding that different people are going through probably very similar situations as you. Small mental skills practiced daily actually create a lasting performance gain. When I go into working with teams at the beginning of the season, I start off with in the very same way across the board. I will ask them, or I will tell them, share with them, never before and never again has this group of people been put together. And so at the end of the season, they may have lost a couple people to the pro ranks or graduation or whatever, and they recruited a couple more people. Even if they lost one and gained one, or even if they lost one and gained none, the identity of that team is different. And through small, incremental meetings, we can start to apply different things. That's never happening in one workshop. I have no illusions that this 60-minute conversation is going to revolutionize your life, but hopefully it plants a seed for you to start to reflect on how could we do things differently? How could we sustain mental performance? How could we implement this in small daily doses? Let's implement these 5-minute mindful breaks, right? 5 minutes, put your phones down, computers off, and let's just kind of sit and breathe, right? We're engaging the muscles that make a lasting impression. And finally, sustainable care starts with self-care. Take care of yourselves from a mental health standpoint, but also from a mental performance standpoint. In rural healthcare, you are the elite performers in medicine, operating at the edge of resources and still showing up every single day. So let's make sure your mind is trained to keep up with your heart. Thank you. I am told that you are familiar with the QR code situation that's going on over here. I'm happy to entertain any questions that are just asked in the room, but if you feel more comfortable submitting them here, then feel free to, I think there's a microphone floating around. So fire away.
Yes, right there.
Okay. See, you all know how to do this. I don't. Okay. Okay, so this first one here, how do you help key stakeholders, coaches, and oftentimes athletic directors and people like that value mental performance in sport, and how can you implement those? And I think here we're trying to understand, like, how do we sell it? How do we get people to buy in? How do we get people to invest in something like this? I was taught in grad school, do good work and good things happen. And that can be a slow process, right? Because it takes a while for people to know that you're doing good work. But I think advocacy becomes the key. I've been involved in UK athletics. And if I want to try to encourage our athletic directors to hire a new practitioner, they rarely listen to me. They will listen to everyone else because they expect that to come from me. And so if folks in your position who are not mental performance specialists are going to key stakeholders and really communicating the possible value of this, then that becomes way more impactful than me trying to convince them. Because they're going to think I'm either just looking for a colleague, or I'm looking for a little bit of relief, or I'm looking to make a little money, versus, hey, I think this is something that will eventually make us better. And there's very little data that shows like, okay, mental performance equals an 80% growth or all that kind of stuff. It's really difficult to really evaluate the impact of those things. Strength conditioning, athletic training, those things are tangible. It's easy. Like if you do these exercises, you gain so much muscle mass, and so you're able to run faster and jump higher and all that kind of stuff. Sports psychology, it's really difficult to tease out exactly what impact we're having. And so I'll often have conversations with coaches. Coaches will say, well, like this person has been coming to see you and their performance has sort of been doing this all season. Why isn't it going up, right? And so I will quite frankly say, like, is it possible that I'm preventing this? And like it's taking everything that I'm doing to just kind of helping them hang on. And so it's not a linear relationship, but I think helping people understand that like mental health professionals are there to do no harm. We are there to really help boost. And so it can't possibly hurt is usually my response to that. Are there any, I want to make sure that I entertain questions, like if people want to stand up and ask, but I also understand. What are them? Oh, okay. So Going back to my, oh yeah, go ahead.
I have the mic and I would actually like to ask you a question.
Fire
So
away.
a lot of these strategies that you're talking about are like in one-on-one conversations with players that you're talking to. So for some of us that manage large teams, can you talk about like applying some of these strategies in like a group setting, or are they really more appropriate for like one-on-one conversation?
So in psychology, we have this fun way of answering questions like this by saying it depends. It really does. And it's a nice cop-out because there is no direct answer. So coaches and leaders will often ask, like, is it better to do a group workshop with everybody, or do you want to meet with everybody individually? The short answer is both. From a group perspective, you're able to reach a larger audience, but you can be less specific. So you're providing more general information. And so what's going to help any individual athlete is going to be different because their experiences are very different compared to, to different individuals. So let's say we're doing something like we want to implement mindfulness techniques in the workplace. And so we can do a group workshop on mindfulness and provide some very specific, tangible things like every day we're going to have a 15-minute mindful break in the morning and a 15-minute mindful break in the afternoon, right? And so rather than meeting with everybody, which is going to be challenging, but when you do meet with everybody, you're, okay, what specific challenges are you facing to experience 15 minutes of mindfulness, right? Well, I can't quite disconnect, or it's really difficult for me, and I can't get comfortable, and all these different kinds of things. So that's a very difficult thing to do as a group. But there are ways in which you can provide a general workshop. We have this rule in mental performance that I call it the rule of thirds. If I'm speaking to a group, which I'm guessing is probably pretty accurate right now, a third of you are bought in, you're paying attention, and I can tell exactly which ones are because I see the nodding heads and things like that, unless you're really good at faking it. So a third of you are bought in, a third of you are window shoppers. You may pick up on a couple things, maybe implement them, but by and large, you're going to keep doing what you're doing. And the third of you are just completely checked out, right? Admittedly, as a hockey player growing up, I was part of that last third until I started to pay attention and I kind of slowly moved over here. And so if you're doing group workshops in the same way that we teach, pick a group where you can have the largest impact, right? So research and maybe even hire somebody that's an expert in that space. For things like mindfulness, it could be a yoga instructor. Yoga is incredibly mindful. And so nobody has a phone during yoga. So that could be an opportunity for you to start implementing some of these techniques in a group setting. But it is challenging because then you're sort of relying on people taking the information and then applying it themselves. And there's very little follow through. So my recommendation is always like pair the group stuff with the individuals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You also have one on Hoover.
Okay.
Do you work with coaches as well as players at UK? And are they trained in strategies to continue to support the student athlete's mental performance?
Yeah, the quick answer is some are really bought in and some are fine with the fact that I exist, but they're kind of doing their own thing. Yes, I work with coaches. And in fact, that is a really great way to implement more widespread change. And so it kind of has that trickle down effect because, again, I'm putting just a random number to it, but I would say about 85 to 90% of the issues that I hear in one-on-one sessions have to do with coach grievances. They don't hear me. I'm not getting the type of feedback that I need. I am not getting my needs met. And so I was sold on this place because of the recruiting thing and all that kind of stuff. Everything was bright and shiny when I came to visit. And now all of a sudden I'm in and it's totally different than what I was promised. And so as a way to sort of make it so that I see fewer people, I go to the source and I have conversations with coaches like, hey, tell me about your coaching philosophy. Like, what is it that you value as a coach? What is your purpose for being here? What is your coaching style? And we have conversations over the course of months and years about what that looks like. And then eventually, when we have a solidified philosophy, we get to, well, how do you implement that? How do you live this? Are you walking the walk, or are you just saying things to recruits and parents and things like that and then doing something completely different? So if we can stimulate change with the powers that be, which is kind of the most fun part of doing what I do, then it does make everybody else's life a lot easier. But again, it's hard to crack that shell because to be a head coach, especially at the Division I level, you have to have a certain amount of ego, and it's hard to admit that you're lacking in anything. And so some coaches feel like, I've got it covered. If athletes want to go see you one-on-one, that's totally fine with me, but I'm good. So it's taken some time, but for the most part, coaches are very receptive to this, because I think at any time when you're providing them with an opportunity to get better, they will accept it. How are we doing on time? Are we still in good shape? Okay.
Yep.
Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. We have seen some high performance athletes. Oh, yeah, it depends. It honestly does depend what the wall is, and when it showed up and how it manifested. And so I remember when it happened with, Simone Biles specifically, the chatter around, the media was like, how in the world could this person like be struggling? Like, look what she's able to do. Her capacity is way up here, but she was able to recognize where her ability was. And so going back to, if I can blend the middle question and the right-handed question together, when I'm sitting on, let's just say I meet somebody for the first time and I share what I do, similar to when I met the nurse on the plane, the conversation inevitably gets to, what are the most important mental skills that athletes can have? Like, in your opinion, in your experience through 20 years of doing this, like when you've seen the best of the best, what do they all possess that we can all learn from? That's an impossible question to answer, right? Because nobody in here is Michael Phelps or Simone Biles or Usain Bolt or any of these people. But one of the things, and this is purely anecdotal, this is not based on any sort of research, this is just me reflecting on my career. One of the things that I've learned is that the folks that operate as close to their capacity as possible, as consistently as possible, tend to have three things. The first one is authenticity. They are authentic. They are truly themselves. They are not trying to mimic anybody. They are not trying to design their own training to resemble Usain Bolt's. They are not trying to be like Michael Phelps with the hood and the headphones and all that kind of. They recognize, what do I need to be me? And I will tell you, the moment that they can be their true authentic selves without any sort of fear of like reprimand, their career takes off. And I think that goes into any sort of performance. If you can just do your thing, if you recognize that you need 30 minutes in a quiet space before you can really get your day going, then get to work 30 minutes earlier. Like, it's really that simple. Like, just be authentic about, like, these are the things that I fundamentally need to be my best self. So authenticity being number one. The second one is self-awareness. And so this kind of goes with this third question here, which is, do you have the ability to really check in and evaluate what it is that you need at any given point? Are you able to do body scans? Wow, my heart's really racing right now. I wonder why that is. And then kind of think back to, what is it that's actually happening? So are you self-aware enough to admit some of the things that you're really good at and the things that you're kind of lacking? And then this third one, which ended up starting by being sort of a throw-in, but I've seen over time that it's become one of the more important ones, is empathy. Do you have the ability to really walk in another person's shoes? So I mentioned nobody's doing it alone. And so even individual athletes, like my track and field self in high school, I thought I was on an island. It was by myself. If I lost, it was on me. Nobody is doing anything by themselves. Individual athletes like Simone Biles or tennis players, which are individual sports, they have a team. They have a team. And so if they're able to understand empathy, the difference between empathy and sympathy, and really check in, then that allows them to really propel forward as well. Share a day in my life. Like I mentioned, I do a lot of corporate consulting as well, so I kind of sprinkle that in all over the place. A typical day would be teaching a class, having random graduate student meetings, talking about research, those kinds of things. I've got a little electric scooter, which has been a godsend, by the way, because my office is on the opposite side of campus as Memorial Coliseum. So I just zip on that and go over. Meeting with coaches, I usually give about one group workshop a day with various teams. Typically, the cadence will depend whether or not they're in season or not. So last night I met with the volleyball team. They're getting ready for to play, I think, 4 games in like 10 days. So they're kind of like, they needed to be grounded a little bit. So we chatted with them, follow up with a couple individual sessions. And so every day is kind of has a pattern, but it also has a fun, chaotic, I don't know what's coming next to it, which is really, really nice. So there is no typical day, but usually it involves a little bit of everything. Any other thoughts or questions? I'll hang around for a bit if you want to chat. So thank you very much for your attention.
That was awesome. I took such voluminous notes, and I'm going to spend at least 3 minutes at the end of this, and I'm going to jot down the things that I learned today. That was a great tip.